Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Jake from RolexMagazine.com. And today I have Cameron from Craft and Tailor with me.
Hey Jake, how's it going?
Great. How are you?
Good. It's so nice, actually, being able to like look at each other when we're talking because most of the time we're on the phone and I'm all over the place, flying around or going from meeting to meeting. So this is a nice treat.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about watches and wonders, which is really
Yep.
exciting. And Cameron is going to be representing Rolex Magazine at Watches and Wonders in Geneva, Switzerland, coming up in what is it about? We're about a week away now.
I think even less actually. I'm flying
Oh yeah, I'm
tomorrow, which would be Saturday, so I'm getting into Geneva a few days before. But I think we're like, yeah, maybe less than a week away from the first day of the event.
that's
So
right. Yeah,
really exciting.
I'm going senile because as we see here, it's in it's in
3 days,
days.
5 hours, and 30
Yeah,
minutes.
boy, somebody's confused. Um, when you're in Geneva, you're going to be meeting with the Crown
Yep.
and getting a presentation on all the novelties. And there's a lot of buzz right now, obviously, where people are guessing on the internet as is normal.
Yep.
Um, and you mentioned that you did a video earlier today on your best guesses.
Yeah, I did a little video on like our Instagram and on our socials where I kind of, was going through what I thought my kind of best guesses or predictions were. Obviously, to your point, the internet is buzzing and people are creating all kinds of mock-ups and that kind of stuff, which is always like really fun and exciting. But I did a little video on what I think maybe they might be coming out with based on kind of what I'm reading, what I'm seeing, and also just some of the stuff of what I would just like to see. I think some of my guesses might be just wild, and they're kind of like on my wish list of what I would hope Rolex would come out for a collector, an enthusiast, and an expert in the field for myself. So a little biased probably in my predictions, but yeah, used my best guesses based on all those things to kind of come up with my predictions.
So share a little bit with us about who you are, just so that the folks out there understand.
For sure.
Um,
Yeah. So my name is Cameron Barr. Most people call me Cam. The internet, I guess, recognizes me as Cam Barr. But I founded a company called Craft and Tailored about, I guess, going on 9 years ago officially at this point, which specializes in the acquisition and really more the celebration of vintage watches. Definitely a huge fan of Rolex and the history and the design language that we see with Rolex. And my company specializes in the acquisition and verification and authentication process in most cases for these watches. And throughout my tenure in the business and also as a collector myself, watches have really brought me all over the world. So last year alone, I flew over 450,000 miles, and all of those 450,000 miles, I actually flew more, but those 450,000 miles were really dedicated to the pursuit of vintage watches and watches as a whole, in support of the horological community, as well as kind of hunting these watches, so to speak. So I guess you could say I'm a collector. I think some would call me a hyper aficionado, nerd, freak, savant when it comes to vintage watches and in horology as a whole. But I'm also an obsessive as it relates to watches, and so that travel and that kind of relentless mania, so to speak, has been dedicated to watches.
how old are you?
I am 38.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So I would argue that you're kind of like the next generation.
Yeah, I'm definitely not your granddad's watch collector or granddad's watch dealer or horological expert. I'm definitely on the younger end of the spectrum for sure. Um, but I think at my age and also with my tenure in the field of collecting and and acquisition and ultimately dealing in these pieces, I'm kind of in the middle of the pack these days. I'm definitely feeling my age a little bit because there are enthusiasts and collectors that are a bit
Yeah.
younger than me. But I'm also working with a lot of the established, what we would call like OGs in the field, who have been in the business for 40 years or in the collecting side of things for a really long time. And before I started Craft and Tailored, I was actually just a collector. I was an enthusiast. I had a passion for watches, but I had a job in the technology business, and then really my passion kind of became my job. Fortunately, so yeah,
450,000
that's
miles?
that's a lot of butt in airplane seat time.
Dude, you're outpacing like the Harlem Globetrotters.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because we call these things like our tours. I love like rock and roll stuff and music ephemera and the history and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of relate to guys that are touring musicians because we're in these amazing locations all over the world. And in a way, kind of doing this in support of a passion similar to a musician. But the thing that is so amazing about doing this and really calling it my job and my career and kind of my life's work is that the community, the people we meet, the locations we're in, it's so amazing, and I think it yields to an element of experience and perspective that is kind of unlike maybe that of your average collector or enthusiast, because we really embed ourselves in these different watch cultures all over the world, which gives you an amazing perspective, especially into the community, because you know this element of the collector spirit is something that I also really associate with, and in some cases kind of feel a little bit crazy on. Like, who would fly 450,000 miles for watches? You kind of have to, in a way, I think, be a little bit crazy to do that. But it really allows us to have a perspective into kind of these little microcultures within the community as well, and how that is different in, say, Europe or in Asia or in the Middle East versus just here in the U.S. So it's been really an eye-opening experience over the past 8 or 9 years, and I'm really excited to see where this adventure takes us.
Wow. Yeah, I see on Instagram all the time you document your travels, and like recently you were in Tokyo, I think,
Yep.
and you're in these. You visit like watch stores
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Tokyo and buy watches from the watch stores.
Yeah, I think the one interesting thing is at the dealer level, right? There are dealers and auction houses and kind of these aggregators, especially in Tokyo, that we work with that aren't really accessible to the public. And one of the things that we wanted to do is kind of break down that third wall and show everybody in the community as a whole what that's really like, because I think that's an interesting side of our community and our passion that really doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think we have a unique position in the content space and in the business and as an enthusiast to kind of share that stuff with the world. Whereas traditionally it hasn't been something that has been either really publicized or talked about or shared. And I think, I don't want to necessarily call it gatekeeping, but in some of these areas, you have to be a vetted veteran. You have to have references. You kind of have to be a dealer in order to gain access to this. And that community has also really embraced us because it's facilitated an awareness around what we all love so much. And I believe in transparency within the community as well, as it relates to how these things kind of move, how they move behind the scenes, how the dealers and the collectors and the aficionados come across this stuff. So there's that side of the business, and then the other thing is, kind of going into my, maniac, obsessive pursuits of these things. I'm always going into these different shops in these places as we travel the world hunting watches. And so, you know, I'm a natural hunter by spirit and kind of within my ethos. So if I walk by an antique store or a little vintage watch shop in Tokyo or in Rome or in Paris or whatever, the other thing that I think is really important is to facilitate where these places are. And in the beginning, when I was starting to travel for watches, I would kind of just like everybody else Google vintage watch shop Tokyo. And these places would pop up, but you couldn't really figure out what they had. Did they specialize in Rolex? Did they specialize in Breguet? Did they specialize in Patek? Did they have a lower price point thing? Were the watches in good condition? Were they correct? And so one of the things that we've done, and I kind of feel like it's my responsibility to do this, is share these resources with people. So that way, if somebody, say, is in the US and they're going on vacation or traveling to Tokyo, they kind of have this pre-vetted list of, or a guide rather, to where to find this stuff, and kind of go through like, hey, these guys are, straight up great dealers. They specialize in these watches. This is the type of price point of watch you're going to find. Or, hey, here's this other cool little spot. Matter of fact, there's two really cool shops globally that I go to myself. But one of them is in Hong Kong. I would venture to say it's the smallest watch shop in the world. It's on Pottinger Street. The gentleman who runs the shop, his name is Raymond. He is this tenured veteran of the watch business in Hong Kong. And his shop is literally like a small display case in the middle of central Hong Kong on Pottinger Street. And Raymond doesn't have Instagram. He doesn't have a website. He doesn't have even a telephone in his little stall. He literally is like on the street in Hong Kong, and he has some amazing watches in this little shop. So without that awareness, you'd be lucky to just stumble across that. And there's another great shop called Montremania in Paris, and it's literally like I don't even know how many square feet the shop is, like 20 square feet. It's like this little tiny shop. And the first time that I discovered the shop, I was in a cafe in Paris, and I ran into somebody who started talking to me about the watch that I had on my wrist, and we got into a watch discussion. And he goes, "Oh, you have to check out this tiny shop called Montremania." And he's like, "If you don't know exactly where to look, you're going to miss it." And it's literally like under a stairway in the middle of Paris. And same thing, he's a little bit more on like social media and accessible. But I walked by the shop like 3 times before I slowed down enough to really figure out where it is. And that shop is full of these amazing gems in the heart of Paris. And so that's another thing that I've really dedicated a lot of time and energy into, is kind of, in a way, educating the community, but like kind of driving an awareness to kind of these kind of off the beaten path places that have these amazing marvels of horological masterpieces, like kind of hidden in plain sight. So that's another thing that we're really dedicating a lot of time to. And we have the opportunity to travel to these places for watches, but ultimately, sharing that with the community is something that's really important to us.
And what percentage of your sales are Rolex?
I would probably venture to say over 80%, probably pushing 90%. Definitely heavily focused on Rolex and Tutor. I think one of the things that differentiates maybe Craft and Tailored, which is the company that I founded and ultimately run, is that we really only curate and bring in watches that we have a true passion or an affinity towards. I'll say that my taste and that passion is kind of ever evolving and changing, but I personally love Rolex watches. I love Tudor watches. I love the history behind them. And that's kind of where my eye naturally goes. But I would say, even though we have other brands like Cartier and Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe and brands like that, I would say a majority of the watches that we have and curate is definitely heavily in the Tudor and Rolex range for sure.
So what is it about Rolex that you love?
I think if I really peel back the layers of the onion, and this is something that you and I talk about, this is the first time that we've really kind of publicly had this type of, virtual hang or discussion. But I think, for Rolex, there's just this like allure and mystique to the brand, and they've created a product over a very long period of time that yields towards the explorer, the adventurer, the businessman. When I put a watch on my wrist today, I'm wearing a vintage Rolex Explorer 1 reference 1016. This was a watch that was created for the adventurer, somebody that was like, say, out in the field, maybe mountain climbing, maybe exploring or doing something of that sort. I'm kind of transported to a different time and place. And the reality of that is I'm not necessarily wanting to go back to, say, in this instance, 1974 and kind of relive the 70s, but it kind of yields this element of spirit of the adventure, spirit of being out there. It's a watch that is also functional and has this artisanal element with a ton of thought. And I think you see that through all of the Rolex watches, from the dress line to, like, say, the pre-war watches into the 70s, even into the modern watches. That's what Rolex really means to me. It's this kind of vehicle to an experience or to a feeling. And that's really why I think with Rolex, it's something that I've developed an affinity towards over the years.
How did you first discover Rolex?
So what's interesting is I was a watch guy for a long time, and I started with just interesting mechanical watches, Hamiltons, Seikos, those kinds of watches. And with those watches, I was kind of drawn into kind of the mechanical elements of these things. I thought it was so interesting that in this digital age, right, this
By
digital
the way,
world.
when I don't mean to interrupt, but you mentioned you're wearing your Explorer.
Yeah,
And when I think of the Explorer, I think of this beautiful vintage
such a great ad.
Rolex ad.
And
Um,
and this is what I think of, right? I think of this when I think of Rolex. They had the best advertising. They had the best messaging. And I think even still to this day, we buy these things, and the reality is, like, a watch is kind of an obsolete thing. Back in the day when you were, say, you know, going to the top of the Matterhorn, you needed a timekeeping device for your expedition. It was a crucial element. Now we can just check our phone for the time or whatever, but I think that is still a feeling, and that reverence for adventure or this passion or this time and place is something that exists within Rolex and horology as a whole. But Rolex just did such a great job of not only marketing and telling the story, but also creating a product that really yielded towards whatever that adventure or that time and place was. So I was interested in mechanical things and watches, and I'd always known about Rolex. I through the advertising and just kind of the allure of these different watches, and I started off with a Rolex Submariner. Was a reference 5513, so no date sub. The watch that I had kind of stumbled upon was a 1967 meters first Submariner, meaning that the depth rating displayed the meters of the water resistance instead of the feet. And the watch really was kind of in disrepair. I think what had happened is the gentleman that brought the watch into the shop that I acquired it from, I think the bezel had come off the watch or something like that, and he put it in this drawer for years. And then through time, other components were kind of just misplaced, and the watch kind of was in, disrepair. And so I kind of bought that watch. And ultimately, what I had to do was learn about that watch and learn about that reference, because I had to find a bezel. I had to find a bezel insert. I had to find the crown. What was the right crown for this era of watch? It really drew me into the history and also the technical history of Rolex. And what I discovered is that Rolex, not just a master marketer. They weren't just a connecting point to adventure or whatever. They were also really awesome engineers. There was purpose and thought behind every single thing that they did, to the construction of the bracelet, to the functionality of the bezel, to the water resistance or the thread count on the tube of the case that meets the crown. There were so many details that had been thought of for this kind of simple timekeeping device. So that's really the watch that drew me into Rolex. And it drew me in because I had to learn about it in order to kind of bring this piece back to life. And so that was really the first Rolex watch that I had started with. And it just so happened to be a Submariner. But
so it's really
yeah.
funny when I look at this ad. And this is from 1964. Uh, it says, "We built the Rolex Explorer because there isn't any watch repair shop on top of the Matterhorn."
It's genius.
And it begins down here. It says, "This is the watch we engineered for the lonely places.
Yeah. That's
We
something
carved."
I really relate to. And again, this genius storytelling, genius marketing, because I often find myself in various parts of the world in pursuit of these things. And in some cases I'm by myself. The only thing that I have is my bag, my tools and the watch. And you kind of develop in a way like this kind of like friendship with these pieces. Um, this 1016 had kind of this interesting thing that happened recently. I was in Hong Kong and I found a comparable version of this 1016. And truth be told, the example that I had found was slightly better than mine. The case was a little bit sharper. It had a little bit more of like a heavy patina. It was a better example. And there was this element of the collector in me that goes, I could just upgrade. I could like trade mine in for this one, right? And sell mine and kind of, have a little bit of a nicer, crispier example. And then when I really started thinking about that, I realized that this watch had had become like my friend. It had become this item that has traveled miles and miles and miles with me. It's been all over the world with me. It's been that thing where I've looked at it, an uncountable number of times, catching the train, trying to make the flight, going to the meeting. It's been with me everywhere. And so that specific piece, I was like, this one has so much more of a sentimental meaning to me and so much more of my own history in the piece. I couldn't trade it, right? So the thing that I'm learning in kind of my later years of collecting and doing this is that sometimes the sentiment or kind of the heirloom-esque quality of these things is in some cases more important to me now than it maybe would have been, where maybe I could have traded up for that better example, or the other one had maybe a more interesting patina, or was maybe a rarer mark variant. Now I'm kind of like collecting these things and cherishing them for kind of this energy and this history that they possess, and what that means to me in many cases is now more important than the condition or the rarity of the mark variant or something like that. So
You know what? One of my absolute favorite things is about you, and about being your friend,
my dashing good looks.
and working with you. Oh, beside that, beside that, yeah, um, uh, is I've said in the past that I'm kind of like the Sigmund Freud of Rolex, in the sense that like I like to psychoanalyze everything to like the nth degree.
Right.
Um, so not just like the watches themselves, the people, the manufacturing, the strategic marketing behind the brand, just everything. And my favorite thing, I think, are people who can wax poetic about the brand and the brand's details. And one of the things I love about you is when we chat, you're so articulate when it comes to Rolex, and your knowledge is so deep. And I know that if you don't know something, you'll say, I don't know, which is really rare. But I know if you don't know something, you say, I don't know. And then the next time I talk to you, it's bizarre because it's like you've developed this encyclopedic knowledge on this new subject, which I guess is your nature. And another person like Eric Koo is an example.
Yeah.
Like I love chatting with Eric because he's so articulate. It's like music to my ears. Like when
Yeah.
he talks Rolex, it's just amazing. But yeah, that's one of my favorite things is your knowledge is so robust. It like kind of freaks me out.
I kind of get freaked out about it as well. And I think the thing that is so awesome, I mean, just within horology, but even specific to Rolex, is I'm still learning stuff. I've dedicated my entire life to this. I've traveled around the world. I don't even know how many times anymore. And I'm still learning things. I'm still seeing things within Rolex that I've never seen before. And I think when you are a collector of things, you're like, okay, there's that passion of the pursuit, passion of the hunt. I'm still passionate and I'm still hunting, and I've been doing this professionally now, at a pretty crazy level for going on 9 years, and I'm still learning stuff. I'm still reading and discovering things in books, past auction catalogs, finding these hidden things in plain sight. Um, and it's not just with Rolex; it's with all of horology. I think like you could spend a lifetime doing this and still not know everything. And that's what's so interesting about this.
Well, welcome to my world. Um, in the sense that uh, I recently posted this. This is my best guess
Okay.
at what Rolex might be showing off, because to me,
Oh man.
it's the 70th anniversary of the Rolex Submariner,
Now let me
and
ask you a question. Is that a steel Submariner or is that a titanium Submariner?
that is a very good question. Um, I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's stainless steel,
Okay.
but it's really screwball because I'm a hardcore knockdown drag out Rolex historian,
Yes.
and keep discovering crazy new stuff about Rolexes. I have a series of books I'm working on, a dozen volumes. It'll be starting to come to market soon. I'm shooting for this coming Christmas for launching volume
Oh
one.
man, I can't wait.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's going to be incredible. As a matter of fact, I'll show you. I think I have it up here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Here's the cover art for
Wow.
volume one.
I love that early coronet as well. It's such a cool coronet.
Yeah, yeah, and all my book covers are all contextually sensitive, so that's why I started with the early
Yep.
coronet that's from this era. Now, what's funny about volume one is you'll notice it says volume one of five, 3000 BC to 1940, and that's because originally I was trying to write one book, and I realized when I got to page like
Couldn't do it.
1100 that wouldn't work, and then it went to 5 volumes, and now it's up to 12 volumes. Um, but you'll notice with volume one, it begins at 3000 BC, which is little over 5,000 years ago. And the reason why is because I take the reader through the history of timekeeping and what it's meant for mankind, so that by the time we arrive at Rolex and Hans Wilsdorf in London, England in 1905, you have a really good understanding of how what the world looked like to him. Um, but I'm like you. I'm a complete nut job when it comes to uh, trying to dial in on details. And recently, my research team and I have been discovering all kinds of crazy stuff about the early history of the Submariner that's never been documented before. Uh,
I also, one thing that you really helped me learn, if I can call it out really quick, is most people call it the Submariner, and I flip between calling it the Submariner and the Submariner. And the true way to say it is Submariner because it was named after the submariners, which is a person that serves aboard a submersible vessel. And I've talked to some, as you have as well, some veteran submariners from various navies, and they are very quick to tell you that it is not Submariner. I'm not a submariner. I am a submariner, which I think is something to draw attention to because technically everybody's pronouncing it wrong, right? Because everybody calls it the Submariner, but it's really the Submariner, which is
yeah,
kind of an interesting thing that I learned from you, and then which was re-emphasized many times after I've met some of these veterans and true gentlemen who at the time had worn these pieces while serving aboard different subs and different things like that. But
well, I remember the first time I got chewed out by Bob Barth, the lead Sea Lab Aquanaut,
yep.
and he was really a bizarre creature because he spoke like a hillbilly, and he swore like a sailor because he was a sailor, but he was about as real as the real deal got. And he said to me, he said, you keep saying submariner, but I think you mean submariner. And I said, oh, okay. He said, yeah, because a submariner is a mariner who's subpar, where a submariner is a man who serves on a submarine. And I was like, oh yeah, yeah. I'd never thought about it, but it's still difficult for me. I still say Submariner all the time.
Right.
uh, but indeed it is Submariner,
Right.
uh, which is bizarre, fascinating. As I mentioned, my research team and I have been making amazing progress recently into the really early history of the Submariner, which was developed by Rene Paul Jeanneret at Rolex. And I have a volume dedicated just to him in my 12 book series. And he's somebody that very few people know about. But he's the man who I would argue is most responsible for all of the modern Rolex sports watches, including the Submariner, the GMT Master, the
Yep.
Milgauss, the Daytona, like you name it, the Day Date. He started with the Date Just. Um, he is the most fascinating character in the history of Rolex for me. And Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex, is also, equally fascinating. But Rene Paul Jeanneret was just really something else. And so we've been dialed in for a long time on unearthing the genesis of the Submariner, and how did it get the spinning bezel, and there's been this thing going on for a long time about this myth that said that Blancpain perhaps
Was
came
the
out with
first.
with their 50 fathoms,
Yep.
much that they somehow were that somehow the Rolex Submariner was a derivative of it, or a knockoff of it, or something to that effect.
Right.
And I go wherever the truth leads me.
Yep.
So if that were the case, that's what I would report, and I'd be more than happy to. It wouldn't bother me. As much as I'm a Rolex fanboy, I'm a much bigger fanboy of the truth.
Well, and
And
I
getting
think to that point too, one thing to keep in mind with a lot of these things, and the thing that I'm constantly reminded, and one thing that's really reinforced is back in this era and time, the internet didn't exist, right? And
Mhm.
I think a lot of the factual information for these types of things, which now have been really kind of put into a category of becoming like an icon of design and or functionality, there wasn't an internet archive that was like, okay, on this date at this time, this is when this was released. And so the fascinating thing for me, and the thing to your point that I'm very open and aware to, is change and learning about these things as it kind of comes together. And I think in the early 1950s, these developments from a technical perspective, um, weren't as important necessarily as they are today. And I think it's hard for the collector and maybe the more modern thinking person that is obviously of the modern era to really realize that a lot of this history is in some cases isn't black and white, and discovering the facts takes a lot of time. And I think what's really exciting for me is learning more about this stuff through people's interest, right? And the development of what is ultimately factual, I think, can change, right? And so, to your point, was it Blancpain? Was it Rolex? Whose was it? And I think even to the point of like, the Explorer being the first watch to the top of Mount Everest, that history behind that was so interesting, and it was kind of miscategorized for a really long time. Rolex was a master marketer, and a lot of these companies, these types of like expeditions and these worldly events are a lot different back then than today. And the association of those products from a technical perspective
Well, you
yielded in.
bring up a fascinating point with that, with the because when I came along, there were all these myths that were out there,
Right.
and I've struggled to separate the fact from the fiction. And one of the great myths was that the Rolex Explorer summited Everest along with Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay in
Yep.
1953, and it turns out that that wasn't true. Um, and this is a concrete example of when I'm led to believe one thing, and I discover something else, I publish it, and so I believe that because that's what people said. Um, until I did a really deep dive. And what I discovered that's so fascinating about that is that the team of the British team um, that were the first to conquer Everest were equipped with Rolex Oyster Perpetuals
Right.
that Hans Wilsdorf had given to them for that reason. The challenge, though, is that Tenzing Norgay and Shredman Hillary were not on the team that was supposed to summit. And ironically, the two guys who were both equipped with Rolex watches.
Right.
And they had an equipment malfunction, so they weren't able to go. And Sir John Hunt, out of desperation, threw a Hail Mary and said, well, okay, you know, they're not going to make it up, but I've got a yak herder and a beekeeper from New Zealand, and what the hell? You guys want to give it a shot? Go ahead. And they
Yeah.
went and they summited it. And but the supreme irony Rolex story behind that is that they were not wearing Rolex watches, but they both owned Rolex watches.
Right.
And what's weird is Tenzing Norgay had received a Rolex on his 1952 expedition, a yellow gold Rolex. Um, that was engraved on the back that one of the lead climbers gave him as a gift, as a token of his appreciation, because Tenzing had basically saved his life getting him up to the summit.
Right.
So when Tenzing was going on the 1953 expedition, his wife said, "You can't wear that gold Rolex. If something
It's
happens to you."
it's like our savings account. It's like the most
Exactly.
expensive thing in our family. Yeah.
Exactly. So they decided to leave it behind. And ironically, my understanding is the same thing happened with Sir Edmund Hillary as well. He had a Rolex and he didn't wear it because he was afraid of damaging it, and it was the most expensive thing he possessed. So
Right.
it's ironic that they both owned Rolexes, but were afraid to wear them
Yeah.
going up to the summit. Um,
Jake, I'd,
yeah.
I'd love to see your sketch again on the or your prediction. This I haven't seen this yet, and I can't stop thinking about it. So it's a no date Submariner,
Oh yeah.
5 lines of text. Am I right? One, two, three. No, four. Okay, so 4 lines of text.
Yes.
Submariner in red. Depth rating with a superlative chronometer rating. Purest form of the Submariner or Submariner. Let me correct myself, because you don't have a date complication at the 3 o'clock position on the dial, which I think
Exactly.
is also something really valuable, because obviously with the early subs, you didn't have a date complication until the introduction of the 1680, which was really in like 1968-ish, right? There's
Mhm.
some kind of fuzziness around the exact date, but with the introduction of the 1680, this is a cool watch.
Yeah, so you bring up an interesting point that I think was it Charles Teal brought up on Instagram, on the Rolex Magazine Instagram account. He said, "Well, of course they're not going to come out with this watch because the 1680 was the first Submariner to have
Red text.
the yellow." Yeah, but I don't believe that's true though, because I've seen examples of really old, no crown guard Submariners that have they. It didn't say Submariner in red, but it had the depth
Depth
rating
rating.
in red.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think what's interesting about that is there's a lot of speculation around why red was used. I think it was based on my understanding and my scholarship, if you want to call it that, on the subject, is I think red was used to highlight something special or notable element. So in the earlier subs, you see depth ratings in red. I've even seen a couple of interesting GMTs. Matter of fact, Monaco Legends Group is auctioning a very early and very special GMT that has red text on the dial. And so I think it's plausible that they could re-release a sub with red text, especially to commemorate something, to pay homage to the past.
well,
And I would love to see the red text on the dial.
for me, this night, 2024 is the 70th anniversary of the Submariner. Now,
Yep.
a lot of people argued with me on Instagram and they said, no, 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 it's 1953.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that's true. And here's why. Rolex began development on the Submariner in 1951, making prototypes of it and
Yeah.
testing them. They reached peak testing in 1953 in Marseille and in the Mediterranean with Dmitry Rebekov, who played a significant role in the development of the
Do you want
submariner.
to know what's, I think, crazy about this as well?
Hmm.
So today, if we're going to test something, we're going to put it in a lab. We're going to have a pressure testing device. We're
Yeah.
going to like, create this environment in which this object is going to live in, right? And that's how you get your, you know, certified depth rating, blah, 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 blah. Back then it was like, well, how are we going to test the depth rating? Okay, we're going to put it on the wrist of an explorer or an adventurer, and they're going to actually use it. That's our validation for testing, right? That
Yeah.
would never happen today. That we're like, oh, like, can this thing really go to this depth? Well, yeah, let's create an environment that creates a pressure chamber to push 1,000-meter depth rating or whatever, right? But back then, to go down to 120 meters or 200 meters or whatever it was, a man, had to put that thing on his wrist and go do that. And then if the watch came back up and it was dry and it was still functioning, that was the validation point for the authenticity of the claims that they were making, which I think is so cool to think about, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, with Dmitry Rebekov, um, and I'll pop this up here for us to see. Um, he had an organization called the Institute of Submarine Research, and he created uh, this document that's dated October 26, 1953. Um, and his organization was the Institute of Submarine Research. And as we see here, he did 132 dives in 5 months. Um, at a minimum of 40 feet and a maximum of 200 feet. 52 of the dives were to the depth between 130 and 145 feet. And the locations were the Western Mediterranean, in particular, the French Riviera, Aries Islands, North and South Tunisia. And he lists the water temperature and he goes into great detail. But I would argue that he was really kind of like the father of the Submariner along with Rene Paul Jeanneret. I think they co-developed it together.
Yeah.
Um, but we
And we've seen
recently,
that with Rolex through, like, I mean, if we even go into the more modern era, like, Rolex working alongside of like Comex, and there you go, Jacques Cousteau. These guys were obviously pushing the technical boundaries of their equipment. And I think what's even more interesting is it's not even just watches; it's submersibles, it's you know breathing devices, it's photography equipment, right? To put these things in this hostile environment, was the only way to really test them. This is a great sub. Look at the pencil hands. There's not even a differentiation between the hour and the minute hand. Only difference is the length. Lollipop sweep seconds hand. I like how it says Submariner Perpetual. There is no COSC certification, no
no,
crown guards, of course.
there is, but it's very
Is
faint.
it dark?
Yeah, it's super
Yeah.
dark.
And then you have no hash marks between the 12 o'clock triangle and more commonly the 15-minute. So no hash marks, which is really interesting. No red triangle as well. And I think that's the other thing too, is Rolex using that red throughout the history of their designs, right? Like with like on the small and the big crown, Submariners, that red triangle is such an iconic feature. But also, I think at that point in time, serving as a technical reference point for your elapsed time. Um, but this is like really the most pure form of sub ever.
And this watch sold for $150 at the time.
Yeah,
And this
which
watch
which
today
was a
is
lot back then. But all things considered, I think there's what's $150 in 1953? I don't know, but I would imagine that it's not, you know, $10,000, right?
So what do you think this watch is worth today?
I mean, if it had no provenance and all that kind of stuff, you're probably looking at anywhere on the low end 65, maybe 70,000. But provenance and condition play a huge role in uh, the actual tangible value of a watch. I mean, it could be pushing 100,000. I mean, that one looks to be in very good condition. So
This is Rene Paul Jeanneret, by the way.
yeah, you
Uh,
told me that, and I actually
yeah,
have an original copy of this advertisement framed in my office.
yeah, it's so cool.
It's really cool. I think this one is a like a black and white photocopy, but the ad actually is like this really interesting like mid-century orange color. It's a really beautiful advertisement.
Hmm. Yeah, it's gorgeous. The It's fascinating. A diver's dream come true. And
Yeah,
it begins frogmen, professional and amateur deep sea divers, spearfishing clubs, and undersea research institutes all over the world have tested the Rolex Submariner and hailed it as one of the greatest contributions to the safety of diving. Quote, it has proved an indispensable accessory for all diving. D. Rebikoff, vice president of the Institute of Submarine Research, Con. Yeah, it's
so
just
cool.
I love it. I love this old stuff. Um, the so why am I guessing um, that we're going to be seeing uh, a submariner with a red designation? I don't know. I mean, more than anything, it's a watch I want to see.
Yeah.
It's what I want, and I've wanted for a long time.
Well, and
Uh,
that was kind of the interesting thing. I got a lot of comments and feedback on the video that we posted as well, and the feedback wasn't really. It was generated based on us not really leaning into like the hype speculation. It was really us leaning into what we want to see, what is interesting to us and me as a collector and as a much like yourself, like an expert in this field. And whether or not Rolex produces those things, that's to be seen, right? Only time will tell. But I think this, to your point, is something that is like so cool and is something that I would wear. It has all those little elements of Rolex history kind of demonstrated throughout the piece. And I think also, why not a sub with date? Well, I think that this is a more pure form of the Submariner or Submariner. And I think what's interesting is you have, a design language here that is very pure because you don't have the missing, marker at the 3 o'clock position to accommodate the date window. And you have this kind of element of symmetry and more balance to the dial because you have the triangle, the 12, the dashes at the 3, the 6, and the 9, and then you have these broad plots, in the middle of those other markers. And the other thing I think that is interesting is I think when time was measured throughout the day, it was also measured in quadrants. So if you take the 12 o'clock marker and you draw a line between the 12 o'clock marker down to that dash marker at the 6, and then you connect the two dash markers at the 3 and the 9, you basically have 4 quadrants of the watch. And you'll see that in some of the other Rolexes and other brands of watches in that era and time that were producing watches with crosshairs or kind of notating the quarters of the day, being the morning, the late morning, the afternoon, the early evening, and then the night, right? And so I think that that's also an interesting facet to kind of notate about the design language that you see in a no date Submariner, which is a more pure form of timekeeping design. Um,
so somebody on Instagram said, it'd look better without crown guards. It would look pure, and I agree.
yeah,
Uh, so Rolex, if you're coming out with this, I took a lucky guess. If not, then please, 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 please come out with this watch because everybody will love this watch.
I second
Um,
that. Yeah.
and so for me, this is the 70th anniversary. I think the launch date is the 70th anniversary. But what a lot of people do, and I think Rolex does the same thing, is they typically consider it to be uh, when they first started prototyping the watch as being the birth, is
Yeah.
my understanding. And that leads us to our next story, which is Captain Danny wrote,
Yep.
which is brilliant, uh, about the Fanta.
The
Uh,
Fanta. Yeah. This is cool.
and the reason he came up with this was because he came across
The
a
patent, right?
patent,
The patent filing.
yeah, um, that Rolex filed. And it said, thus the process according to the invention is particularly suitable for obtaining a two-tone, notably red and black or red and orange ceramic having a very attractive appearance. And he was like, huh, red and orange. And he said, yeah, I wonder what that would look like. So we put together this image and just mocked it up. Um, Now, if you look at the Rolex teaser, which is on Rolex Magazine right now,
Yep.
and what I'll do is I'll play it muted. Um, and notice it said when the iconic meets the unexpected. That's
I
the
love
theme.
this. This was literally the first thing that I saw in my feed when I woke up this morning. I literally was still in bed. I had this weird intuition that Rolex would be doing something today, and I saw this, and I was like, ah, wait a minute. And I did the same exact thing where I was like, I, I I probably gave the video like an extra 100 views, because I was like sitting there like scrolling it. But
Right.
there's these teasers, but there's a lot of information in these teasers. Jubilee bracelet, but look at that bezel. That bezel is a rotating bezel. Is it a sub bezel? Is it a Milgauss bezel? Is it a GMT bezel?
Well,
It's a rotating
it can't
bezel.
really be a Milgauss bezel unless they added a spinning bezel to the Milgauss.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting that I have learned over the years is the bezel shape and the scalloping on the outside of the bezel
Hmm.
is very indicative of the model that it's going to be on. So that's really something that's interesting because a sub bezel is a little bit more knurled, and the scalloping on the outside of the bezel is quite a bit different than a GMT. And throughout history, we've also seen that. For example, like a GMT bezel has a different shape than a sub bezel would, and the
Yes.
Milgauss bezels, when they were rotating, had a little bit of a different shape than say like a sub or a
So what do
GMT.
you think? What do you think we're looking at right now?
That to me looks like a GMT bezel.
Me
And the
too.
scalloping on a GMT bezel is typically a little bit wider, and it's a little bit it's not as proud, if I can say that. It's a
Yes.
little bit softer.
Yes.
So I
So
think that's a bezel for a
this
GMT.
must be a GMT.
That's that's a GMT. Yeah.
So the question then is, are we going to be seeing a Fanta GMT?
I don't know. I mean, I think
Or
obviously
a lot of people are saying a Coke.
they're saying the Coke, right? Which I also think is interesting, right? There's been like all this hoopla on the internet about like Rolex having issues producing, the red and the blue combination together, and there's something there. I know you and I've talked a little bit about how the first Pepsis that came out, they're actually a little bit more on the pink side with the red. So there's kind of like this Mark One variant of the ceramic Pepsi GMT that has a little bit more of like a pinky kind of hue
Mhm.
to the insert, and then it kind of went to this dark red. I think it would be really interesting and cool if they did it. That's for sure.
Well,
Um,
Rolex lately, last year, at Watches and Wonders went full regalia on color with
yeah,
the emoji watch and stuff like that. So it seems within the realm of possibility. Also, you've got, as Captain Danny pointed out brilliantly, with the OPs, you've got the orange and the red. So
it's plausible.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and or maybe a Coke.
I think a Coke is maybe more feasible and more likely just because, when they released the Coke in, I believe it was 1983, with the introduction of the 16760, aka the Fat Lady or the Sophia Loren, you saw the red and black insert where really leading up into that point, it was a Pepsi insert. Now with the early Bakelite or no crown guard GMTs, there is some speculation that they had like a black and a red variant, but I don't really think that they're black and red. I think it is a blue, and some of those Bakelite radium filled inserts have either gone really dark or really light. I've seen a lot of variants in that, but really interesting.
Well, so in this
I
story,
geeked out over this so hard
I know, man,
when you showed the process for the Cerachrome bezel.
right.
I'm not even, I was standing in my kitchen when you had posted this, and I spent like a good hour standing like in the middle of the kitchen, like in the middle of the room, just like zooming in and scrolling and like looking at this, because what's wild about this, and this is something that I really love, going back to the history of Rolex being an innovator and pushing the technical boundaries of things. Not many people really realize that there's so much that goes into just the insert of the bezel on this watch. You have the composition of the material, the way that they set the material. It's ceramic, so it's fired at 1,000 degrees Celsius. Then you have
Well, look at how much it shrinks.
it's crazy.
This is to
Yeah,
scale. And what's funny is in the second step, it says insert after impregnation with aqueous solution.
yeah. So pigmentation into the ceramic, because ceramic is porous, but ultimately you can polish ceramic to make it like shiny, right? And then it goes through like this insert, which is larger, and then obviously that insert is milled down to then fit into the bezel. And then what's even more wild to me is the coating. So, for example, Rolex pushing the boundaries of like the technical manufacturing of these things, right? What is an anti-corrosive material? Gold, platinum, those types of materials, they're very anti-corrosive. So, I think what you have in here, I'm going to try to read it, but I think it is they use like I believe it's a platinum, and they use a PVD application of platinum. But when you PVD something, basically what happens is that PVD process coats the entire surface. So for example, like on a watch case, or if you're PVDing like a automotive part or something like that, the entire surface of that becomes coated in that material.
Physical vapor deposition.
Yeah. I've spent a deep amount of time on YouTube researching PVD because I think that process and that technology is crazy. But then they take off the PVD so that
Well,
it is
and so
just,
they only use noble metals with their PVD. So
yep,
they're either using 18 karat gold or
or
platinum.
platinum.
Yeah.
Yeah. So not a lot of people realize that in the bezel insert of their watches that it's actually platinum. It's not, it is one of the most noble white metals that
Well,
exists on the
speaking of
planet.
which, speaking about the bezel, I couldn't help myself with this article where I wanted to take a look at this because I think the original
Yeah.
6542
Yep.
reference GMT is maybe they're going to come out with this. Maybe they're going to put loom in the
Oh,
ceramic.
I love it. I
It,
think, and also from a technical perspective, like, with the early GMTs, like that's such an element of functionality. Low light conditions in a cockpit, your bezel's glowing. You can have an indication of, your second time zone, and the bezels are just beautiful. Like this picture is a perfect picture of that, where you have kind of this dimension to the bezel because the blue is really an undercoating, and then the bakelite is clear. So when you have these like kind of almost like, I guess it would be debossed, but it gives you this embossed effect of the luminous material sitting in those channels that are in the Bakelite bezel, and it provides such an element of dimension to the bezel. Not to mention that it's also highly functional because, if that was loomed and glowing, you could actually see it in a low light or low visibility situation. So really, really cool.
So I love, 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 love the design of this watch. Like it's
So
just
cool.
with that glowing. So once again, Rolex, if you're watching this, and if you're not coming out with this now, you like, what are you doing? You got to figure this out. Um, and I don't see why they couldn't do the exact same thing um, with what's it called? The synthetic sapphire that they use is zirconia.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think there definitely is a way to do that. I know there are some companies, there are other brands that still do something that is similar. Obviously, Rolex
you mean the
being
copy that thought Rolex's idea from back then was so great? Let's just make them today.
well, other brands were doing it too, like
Not
the
back,
Omega
not
Seamaster.
1954 or five or six.
Yeah, Blancpain was doing that with their bezels.
Did they?
Omega did that with their bezels all the
Yeah,
way up until like the 70s.
but
With
in
their
1954? Did they?
uh, Omega or Blancpain.
Yeah.
Blancpain did, yeah. They had a Bakelite bezel on their 50
No, no,
fathoms.
but with the loom material.
Yeah, it was loomed.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah. It's really a beautiful bezel. It's definitely a little bit more. I don't want to say elegant. It's a little bit more
Which
simple.
model is that from
The
Blancpain?
50 fathoms, the
Oh,
original 50
really?
fathoms. Yeah.
I never knew that that was loomed.
Yep. And that's
Wow.
when I'm authenticating those watches. I actually will.
Use a
I'm
Geiger
actually
counter?
seeing. I'm looking on my phone to see if I have one that I can share on the screen. Yeah, let me go to mine really quick. I'll show you.
Okay.
I'll go present. Oh wait, here. Let me see if I can drive here for a second.
Okay.
Present. Okay, I'm sharing. Give me a sec, guys. Okay.
Okay.
Is that scrolling for you guys?
Nope.
Weird.
I'm just seeing Craft and Tailored.
Okay, give me a sec. Let me see. I don't know why that's not. Because you can see it, and that's my slide. Are you
Okay.
able to scroll it, Jake?
No.
Hmm.
No.
Weird.
Do you want to pull it up on your phone and hold your phone up?
I could try, yeah.
Okay. I don't know.
Or if
Yeah.
you want to go to my site, here, let's try this.
Oh,
Let me go present, share screen. Boom. Share. Okay. Is that working?
yep.
Okay.
I think so. Your screen's up, but it's not scrolling.
Okay. Give me a sec.
There we go.
Okay. So check this out. So if we look at like these early 50 fathoms, here's a
Oh
53
yeah, you're right.
Blancpain 50 fathoms, reference 2462. You can actually see that bezel is loomed and it has that dimensional effect to it.
Yeah,
So that was
that's right.
something that was kind of cool, back in the day where it was definitely more common. And then I'll show you something cool here. Here's something cool too. So this is a military issued Seamaster, but we'll find another one here from, say, like the 60s. This is a 66. But you can actually see this one has a little bit of degradation, but the bezel's also loomed here and has that kind of like embossed, debossed type of effect, which
Oh
is really
wow.
interesting.
I am totally fascinated about the relationship between Omega and Rolex,
I don't think I have any
and their and
1622.
I covered it extensively in my books.
Yeah, I think, the other thing that is really interesting and kind of great about these companies that a lot of people or a lot of, enthusiasts don't really take into consideration is there was a lot more synergy between the brands, um, in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Matter of fact, Rolex was working with like Breguet for a very long time, and they were employing their hairsprings in their watches. And obviously, you have like the Zenith era Daytona, where Rolex came out with their first automatic self-winding chronograph that leveraged a highly modified Zenith movement. And so I think you have a lot of that kind of synergy as it related to these companies kind of working in concert to create products that were really serving the greater good of the wearer. And I think back in the era and time, if we go back to the sub, this was a tool, and that's where the name tool watch ultimately comes from. It comes from the fact that these watches were being used and leveraged for a purpose. They were purpose-built watches, and it just so also happened that these companies were very artful in the way that they were creating these things. It wasn't just form meeting function. It was form, function, and artistry, which is something that I really love as it relates to horology, and very specifically to Rolex. They were thoughtful designers, thoughtful and masterful marketers, but there was also an element of artistry that you see in the pieces, even at the most technical interpretation of time telling.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but the way it worked was Rolex came out with the Submariner.
Yep.
Well, no, let me go back. Omega came out in 1947 or 1949 with their waterproof watch.
Yes. Very interesting watch. It's actually a watch that uses a case that employs lead. Like it's a lead, like the gaskets were lead
Gasket.
gaskets. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so basically, it wasn't a watch that had any type of bezel or anything like that, but it was a watch that had this really interesting kind of sealing system, which deployed lead as a gasket, because lead is a very soft material. So this basically, they made this case and they kind of encapsulated the movement with lead, and then they smashed it into like this waterproof brick
And
essentially.
it
And
looks like a JJ LeCoultre, doesn't it?
yeah,
Which
like tank
look,
style or
yeah, looks
like
nothing like a sport watch. And
not at
so,
all.
but it wasn't that the original Seamaster?
That's one of the original Seamasters. Yep.
Right. So what's funny is so Omega comes out with, pre Submariner, they come up with like a dive watch that looks like a cross, like a Cartier tank had a baby with a JJ LeCoultre Reverso,
Yeah.
some or other. And then so Rolex then comes out with the Submariner with a black aluminum bezel insert,
Yep.
which has become extremely iconic. Then Omega comes out with the Speedmaster and copies, correct me if, or derives from it, the black bezel insert, but on their chronograph.
Yep.
Then Rolex copies them because when the early Daytona came out, it didn't have that. And so they copied that from Omega into the Daytona, which is now super iconic.
Totally. Yeah. And I don't know if I would necessarily use the word copy, because that might ruffle some feathers saying it in that
Which is my
way.
job.
Yes, professional feather ruffler. But I would say I actually think, in the truest form, it wasn't necessarily about one-upping each other back then. I think there were inspirations, and I think that you can see it in the automotive world. You can see it with cameras, and I'm passionate about all these other things as well. You can see kind of this natural technical progression of these things based on what the competitor was doing at the time. And I think there was much more of, and I don't know if it was necessarily welcome, but there was an embracing of somebody doing something that was pushing the technical advantage of the timepiece. And now today, I don't think that is celebrated as much, and everybody likes to keep everything close to the vest. But I think a lot of these icons were really inspired by what was happening around them. But I think the inspiration also came from a place of technical advancement versus like, a design element that had to be like copied to give a strategic advantage necessarily in the marketplace. I think that times and things change from that perspective. But yeah, you definitely see kind of a similarity of design through these seemingly competing brands.
Well, another
Um,
example would be the Omega Pulprof, right?
yeah,
With the Sea Dweller, that was like their answer, or where they were both pursuing the same thing, but in different directions, which is interesting.
and they're totally different watches. If you look
Yes.
at like a Sea Dweller versus a Ploprof, Ploprof doesn't have a helium escape valve. The Ploprof, I actually have one in our collection right now, is an amazing watch because it's basically like a stainless steel brick with a watch inside of it.
It's like a
And
Panerai.
eh, not even. Like, if you pull up an image of a Ploprof, the watch is just like, it's insane, you know?
2001: A Space Odyssey.
That's it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like there's like no ergonomics necessarily to the case. It's like, how do we make something that can withstand pressure?
And
And
the Explorer 2, the first one with the orange hand,
yep,
has that in common with it, the orange hand.
yeah,
So Omega and Rolex, like throughout history, have going like that.
yeah. Which I think for us as collectors and consumers, as a result of say that like competitiveness, has really yielded some amazing stuff, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
you can
yeah.
also see that in other brands like you know Hoyer, and also keep in mind that back in this era and time, you have a, 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 a commonality in the dial manufacturers. So both Omega, Patek, Rolex, Vacheron Constantin, they were using either Singer or Baylor to produce their dials. And so what's really interesting is you'll also see some like font types appear in other watches that were leveraging the same dial maker, even though the formatting is slightly different. Like Paul Newman fonts showed up in um, uh, Longines watches, you know, uh, all these different watches in some cases had very similar fonts or colors or whatever. And I think a lot of that was as a result of there being a cooperation between the dial or the hand manufacturer and the maker of the watch. And I think if you really peel that back, a watchmaker is different than like a watch producer. In many cases, a watchmaker was taking components from the makers or producers rather, and then composing those elements to a physical product.
Speaking of which, if we loop back to the original GMT with the Bakelite bezel,
Yep.
this is just amazing. And you were talking about the knurling or the
Yep.
distance in between. I mean, this is just amazing looking. So
Yeah,
I
and
don't.
the, and Rolex also was experimenting heavily because like on the early um, you know we'll call them rotating bezels, they went from like a chrome plated brass, then they went to a stainless steel, and there's different variants. So Rolex was kind of experimenting with these materials. Brass naturally is like anti-corrosive, but at the same time brass does develop a patina. So it's interesting kind of tracking the little micro changes that Rolex and other producers were kind of experimenting with during that era and time. And you can actually see that in specific mark variants of watches in specific eras and time. And then we correlate that back to like different known production levels and production runs of various watches.
So we agree, Rolex, if they're not coming out with it this year, this would be a next logical step because I mean, just look at the dimensionality of this, where you have the multiple substrates, where you have the transparent glass, and that could be cubic zirconia.
Yeah.
Uh,
You could use sapphire. You could use all kinds of different stuff really
yeah,
to
synthetic sapphire crystal, which I think zirconia is, isn't it?
yeah,
I think.
definitely.
but I mean, look at the depth of this, and I mean, it's just magnificent. So in this article, I showed off a picture. This is a wrist shot I took in 1999
Wow.
of I had a Coke back then. Um, so these are some shots that Captain Danny put together of what a new Coke would look like.
I think it's a handsome watch. I mean, it's really cool, and the original Coke did come quite commonly on a Jubilee bracelet. That's another thing that I think is really fun about the GMT range of watches is that you see them both on Jubilee and Oyster bracelets. Matter of fact, what's really cool is some of the yellow gold GMTs, they actually produced a president style bracelet for those watches that you sometimes see. They're very rare, but you do see president bracelets with some of the gold models, which is quite interesting. But
Oh, I didn't
I
know
think
that.
that this is also great that it's on the Jubilee in this mock-up because that was kind of the way that the watch was ultimately offered and yields really to kind of Rolex's flexibility in the formatting of a watch back in that era because when you went to an authorized dealer or the jewelry shop, they offered the watch either on an Oyster bracelet or if you wanted, you could put a Jubilee bracelet on the watch. And the GMT has been seen throughout history on both the Oyster and most commonly the Jubilee or Oyster, with there being some exceptions like the yellow gold GMTs. But I think the Jubilee is such an interesting bracelet, and it's a bracelet that, in my opinion, is a little bit more fine. It's a little bit more elegant. I'm sure you know the history behind the name Jubilee and why that bracelet is called the Jubilee, but it's a little bit more jewelry-like, if you could say that. Whereas the Oyster bracelet is definitely more masculine. It definitely has more mass to it. It's a little bit beefier. The early bracelets were riveted bracelets, which kind of adds this almost like industrial kind of look to them. Then they went to, of course, folded link, and then into
This
various other
this being
bracelets.
this
But
has a I had an Oyster bracelet, which is what you would
yep,
have on a Submariner, and then the Jubilee. Yeah, it's more feminine. It's not
yeah,
effeminate, but it's more
I would say
feminine
it's
and
more elegant. It's
dressy.
definitely, yeah, definitely more dressy. It's kind of like, in a way, like mesh like. There's more flexibility and movement in a Jubilee bracelet. Personally, I think Jubilee bracelets tend to offer a little bit more comfort than an Oyster, just because you have more movement in the bracelet. But this is a great watch. Tutor just released this. I'm in love with this watch.
Tell me why.
Well, the thing that's cool about Tutor, and I also did some Tutor predictions, but Tutor is, I think, Rolex and Tutor are now two separate companies, but obviously the history behind Rolex and Tutor is that, Tutor was created as a more economical kind of entry into Rolex's professional line of watches. So basically, in the early part of Tutor's history, you have, Rolex cases, Rolex design language, Rolex crowns, Rolex bracelets, all those kinds of things. But the mechanism, the actual movement in itself, was something that was what we would call a non-in-house movement. So Rolex was basically putting in many cases, like an ETA movement into their watches, or a Valjoux movement into their chronographs, or some variation thereof, and offering a more affordable option to their professional range of watches. So initially, Tudor was the brand that was kind of the economical version of their bigger brother Rolex. But I think recently what we've seen is Tudor kind of proving itself to be more of the testing grounds for Rolex. And what you see is you see a deviation away from the more classic contemporary designs of Rolex, and you see fun things with Tudor. This being a perfect case in point example of this is that you have, this the Tudor Black Bay chronograph, but you have it with this amazing kind of like bubblegum pink dial. Now, I don't know if Rolex would ever do a pink dial. If they did, I think it would be something really interesting and fun and exciting because, I think there's a seriousness to Rolex that you don't necessarily have with Tudor. The brand is more accessible. You're typically, you see Tudors, even though I'm a huge fan of Tudors. and I would be considered a more advanced collector. But you typically see this as the entry point into a fine Swiss sports watch. And I think that fun dials, interesting compositions of the movement, this watch being on a Jubilee style bracelet, I think is really interesting and fun. It's not as serious, and I don't mean that it's not as serious or a professional level watch. It definitely is. When you first hold a Tudor, whether it's vintage or modern, you can feel the quality in that piece. It's definitely a real watch. But I think Tudor has had the ability, especially over the past few years, to really kind of become Rolex's testing grounds, right? You've seen the usage of materials like titanium, right? Before Rolex ever did anything in titanium, it was with Tudor. You see interesting colors before, like the bubble dials or the puzzle watches, or maybe some of the more like intricate cloisonne dials, or the fun kind of interesting colors that you see with Rolex. You see that in Tudor first. So I love this watch because the pink is really cool. I think that, and we were talking about this a little while ago, I think the pink and black just goes really well together. And
especially with the stainless and the white,
yeah, it's
the white
really
markers.
cool.
Yeah, it's. I don't know if I would have done the red on the top of the chronometer hand, but
Yeah, the sweep seconds hand having the red tip
yeah, that looks a
with the
little.
red text. Yeah, the
It's very
decorating in
visible,
red.
but
But it's also something that yields to the collector, right? Because you and I in a Rolex, we'd love to see red text on a dial, but guess what? It's here with Tudor.
yeah, and like I don't think I would love to see this as in like a Daytona.
For sure.
I'd love to see this exact watch, Jubilee bracelet,
Oh
because
God, I
typically the Daytona comes with an oyster bracelet.
oyster. Yep.
I'd love, love, love to see it with the Jubilee bracelet and the same dial, except the with the popsicle sub dials, the like on
Oh, that'd be fun.
the
Yeah. So
bottom, yeah,
like a really wild like accent
red,
color for the subdials.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that would
and
be really cool. I think the other thing that would be that's interesting to note is you know the difference between this and a Daytona. You can see if you look at this, you see Daytona. Even look at the pushers, right? The screw down pushers are very like early Daytona in terms of their like fit, form, and finish.
no
But
crown guard.
no crown guard. Yeah, also no crown guard. But I think the other thing that's interesting is it's a two register chronograph. So you don't have that sub dial at the 6 o'clock position, but right, you're not leaving anything on the table here because you have a date complication there, and that's an element of functionality, right? So I think what's cool is even if Rolex were to produce something similar to this or their own version of it, it would definitely not deviate away from the Daytona being a three register chronograph, but yet also at the same time with the Black Bay Chrono in the bubblegum pink, you also aren't really losing something. You're in a way gaining it. It's just different because you have the date complication at the 6 o'clock position instead of that subdial. So I think like that's the really fun thing about Tudor and Rolex is that you can definitely see Rolex thoughtfulness here. You can kind of see that history and lineage of the brand, but also at the same time, it's kind of its own thing.
I sent Patrick Heiniger, the CEO, at the time of Rolex in I want to say 1999 or 2000, something like that, a letter with an illustration pleading with him to put a date complication on the Daytona in that exact same position. Uh, and they responded like it was sacrosanct, like I was just like completely
You had
lost
four
my
heads at that point.
mind. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I love I think that I think they should offer the Daytona with and without a date. That's just my
Yeah.
opinion.
And some brands are doing that with their three register chronographs, right? The complication of having a three register, the ability to have a three register chronograph with a date complication definitely exists. You'll see it in some brands where they actually kind of like hide it in the subdial. So you'll have like that three register chronograph, and then you'll kind of have like that, like almost like hidden date window. Typically, the date wheel is like kind of like a tone on tone color, and it's actually a nice accent. And I think today, it's one of the things that I use the watches that have a date uh, in them for, is to see what day it is. It's actually a very
So,
functional
so
complication.
one thing I kind of take issue with, and I want your opinion on this, and I know Captain Danny doesn't like it, is the snowflake hand on the Tutor. It's like it's everywhere,
Yeah.
and we both, and I'm not going to speak for him. I'll speak for myself. I would love to see more of like a Daytona hand on this. Um, I think, I mean, I understand what they're doing with making it it's highly iconic, but I think that watch would just look so much cooler with a Daytona like hands. Do you remember a couple, was it one or two generations ago where they had I think it was one generation prior to the current one where they had the fattest Daytona hands with the stripe running through the middle, the black stripe?
Yes, you see that. You kind of saw that in the early, or I guess in the later Daytonas, where you had kind of like you could call them, I guess you could call them like sword hands or
Yeah.
baton style
Yeah.
hands.
Yeah.
And then they went from kind of that tone on tone look with the luminous in the end of the hand to like having like this like black stripe that ran up the center through a channel in the hand. And the hands under loop, and if you really look closely at them, are quite beautiful. Um, but um, but yeah, I think in a way, um, the snowflake hands are they played out? I don't know. I think it's become kind of like an iconic and distinctive, um,
Trademark.
yeah, to Tutor, and that's also kind of interesting because the snowflake hands really come from the snowflake, sub, which was interesting because that snowflake hand was used as a way to differentiate the minute and the hour hand, and it was kind of something that they had offered
It's their
mainly with
Mercedes.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I think it's cool. I think the watch would look better with different hands. But and then we see a
yeah,
picture here of David Beckham, one of the
yep,
greatest soccer players in history, and he's rocking it. Um, and this just looks amazing on him. And it's when we think of pink, we think of feminine.
yeah.
But when I see this, it looks so masculine. It's bizarre to me.
I mean, he's definitely a masculine dude, right? Like he is a very masculine, kind of like the epitome of like badass masculine dude, right?
Yep.
But I think like I think pink is an interesting color. Also, it's not like it's not really like Barbie pink in a way. It's kind of like what I think they would call like a dusty or a dirty pink, which I think is interesting and kind of like more modern. And the way in which he wears the watch is, I think, a great example of like how a watch can be serious, but also at the same time fun. And that's the thing that I really like enjoy with a lot of like Rolex's new releases. Like the puzzle, that was like such a controversial thing. People were like, I hate this. I don't get the point behind it. Like what? Blah, blah. And then if you really peel back the layers of the onion, you're like, oh wait a minute, that's a cloisonne dial. Like that is a handmade. Like the hours of work that must have gone into that dial is like wild, right? And then on top of that, it's a watch that literally was created by Rolex to and promote and invoke different feelings from people, right? And I thought that that was really cool. That to me was, such a cool move by a brand that traditionally has been very kind of just, conservative in their way of like producing watches. And I don't disagree with that, but to see them deviate away from that in such an interesting way while also leveraging and displaying their ability to make amazing watches was awesome. The Bubble is actually one of my favorite watches. I've kind of been quietly looking for one in the 36 for myself because I think it is just such an interesting watch. And it's also about the artfulness of that watch. It's about the interesting character of that watch. There's no complications. It's a time only watch. It's very simple. And it really allows the artistry and kind of the uniqueness of that dial to kind of speak for itself without it being, you know, a chronograph or
Mhm.
having a date comp or whatever. It was like, hey, we thought this dial was cool. We put a lot of time into it. The process of creating that dial is so intricate and so difficult. and I thought it was a perfect way for them to display the watch. So I think, this is so cool. I think the experimentation with other colors is really interesting and cool. And I think we're also seeing um, an element of favoring, because if you look at like the Daytonas throughout history, the Paul Newman Daytonas, obviously those weren't popular watches that are now becoming elements of an icon, right? And then if you look at like the Daytona Beach series of watches, where they were leveraging.
I was just you just read my mind. And if I can interject for 1 second, I want
Yeah,
to
of course.
show you guys something. If I go up to the search field here and I'll zoom in on Rolex Magazine, and you called it Beach Daytona, right?
Beach. Yep.
Beach Daytona, and I hit enter. There it is. This is a new search engine. This is a new visual search engine we added recently.
Oh, awesome.
Um, and that's actually so. At one point, Rolex had a pink Daytona dial.
Yep.
It was mother of pearl. Now, this is not what I was looking for because there are other. That's not it either. This is not a very good photograph. This is low res. This is from 2008, which is the year I
But
started.
what you can see here is like the cool thing about the Daytona Beach, or the and I don't even know if that was like an official term for that.
Yeah. So let me type in beach.
But the cases are white gold.
Oops.
The dials are made out of either a mother of pearl, or like an interesting stone, and they're fun. They're colorful, right? I think
Mhm.
maybe Rolex's idea at the time was to market towards maybe women, or something like that, because of the colors, and
Here
they're
we go.
also
I
on
found
these.
it. Yeah. So this was from the Andre Heiniger era. Um, here's a good higher res version of it. Worth a second glance, even when you know the time.
That's great. And these have increased in popularity and collectability over the past few years. And again, this most likely at the time for Rolex, I don't know if this was probably received that well, right? Because if you were thinking about what Rolex was producing in this time period, it was stuff that was, you know, a bit more contemporary, a bit more, it was, uh, dare I say, predictable, right? But these, colorful lizard straps, and these, these kind of interesting dial layouts were quite interesting, and fun, right? And so I would love to see more of this kind of stuff.
Here's a high res photo of the blue mother of pearl
Yeah,
uh,
it's amazing. You can
Daytona.
see that black line kind of appear in those hands as well.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then I
Oh, and the
think,
other thing too is if you go back up to that, I'll show
yeah.
you a little Easter egg in that.
Okay.
So check out the so look at the four.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at normal Roman, they call that a watchmaker's four,
Mm-hmm.
because basically four would be VI or
Mm-hmm.
IV, depending on the way that you would read it on a dial.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, they call that a watchmaker's four because it's basically four lines in a row, instead of it having a V to indicate, the subtraction of one numeral off of
Yes.
five.
Yes. That
So
makes
I've
sense.
never really seen that outside of this dial before, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Oh, that's a great point. That's a great point. This I thought there's
Your
another
site is so
picture.
cool, man. God, like look at these photos.
Here
So
we go.
cool.
Yeah, so Jake's Rolex World is obviously highly, highly visual. But now that we have
Watches
this new,
themselves are visual, right? Yeah.
yeah, so with this new search engine, so I typed in pink as an example. It's pretty amazing what it'll come up with. Um, so it found Pink Floyd. It found this fuchsia
Yeah.
colored GMT, which is also beautiful. But you see how many pages there are.
With this
Um,
pink stuff.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's crazy what you can find It makes it much easier to
AI
just
is taking over the world.
exactly, exactly. All right. So speaking of which, all right, we got 3 days, 3 hours. So you're getting ready to hop on an airplane to fly to
Yep.
Geneva.
Yeah.
Um, and so
Really
you,
excited about it. I'll say I'm a little nervous too, but not nervous in a way. I think it's more like nervous excitement. I'm so excited for this because Watches and Wonders is I mean it's like the biggest watch event every year, right? I'm so excited to see, what Rolex comes out with. I've almost been. It's like Christmas for me. I've been waiting all year for this event.
yeah,
I'm hoping that and to maybe talk more about what I'm excited and hoping to see. I definitely in my video I think we'll see more cloisonne type of offerings from Rolex. We saw that with the bubble dials and obviously with the puzzle watches. Rolex kind of quietly released like the Philharmonic edition with the violins, the green dial, crazy beautiful, crazy intricate dial design. And I think Rolex and if you look at like any maker, the cloisonne dials are one of the most intricate and difficult dials to make, and they're very artful, which I think is really interesting and cool. Um, Rolex discontinued the Milgauss, and I'm hoping that we'll see a re-entrance of the Milgauss into the lineup because I think that's an important watch. I think it's historically significant, and I also think from a technical perspective, the watch brings so much value to the table. I love the early version of the Milgausses. I'm more of a vintage guy. Not saying that I didn't like the modern interpretation of the Milgauss that we saw for a good period of time. I thought those watches were really amazing, and they also, paid homage to the past with like the lightning bolt sweep seconds hand, and they were interesting. My favorite one was the white and orange accents. I thought that was like really crazy, and the fact that they came up with like an orange lume, like that still blows my mind.
right.
Like, what? That's so cool. Um, but I'm hoping we'll see something that maybe kind of yields more towards the past of that line. Maybe something with a rotating bezel because there were early Melgausses that had kind of like a rotating timing type of bezel, and a lot of them had waffle dials. So a dial that had waffling texture. We saw that with early Rolex, like in the 1950s. A lot of their watches, even some of the Explorers, had waffle dials, which is quite interesting. Um, they flashed a little picture of uh, a dial today in their story that had some texture to it. It's definitely not waffling, so that could be maybe kind of more of like their dress line of watch, which I think would be really interesting to see because typically those watches
So
tend to be.
here's
Yep.
what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
How
Uh,
cool would it be if they reintroduced this model?
I think it would be really cool.
I mean,
I mean, look how
look at that
cool the dial is.
with the honeycomb dial. Yeah, I was thinking the same
Yeah,
thing.
it's so awesome. No crown guards, red triangle in the insert. Really like kind
The
of
arrow markers at
interesting.
3, 6, and 9.
Yep, those
This is
like
just like
arrow.
super art, super late uh, Art Deco, known as Populux, like a Cadillac tail fin.
Yeah, yeah, very like atomic era kind of designs. Um, and such interesting watches. I mean, like the 6541 is right up there with like the big crowns and the pre Daytonas and the GMTs and that kind of stuff. It's such an icon. But I also think that in some cases it throughout history it kind of becomes like the forgotten icon. Kind of falls in and out of fashion, and then the other Milgausses that Rolex released rather through its history, they kind of take on these different shapes and forms. You know, uh, where they're less artful, more tool based. This ad is like the coolest thing. Like this, like little like atomic Milgauss ad with like the atom like swooping around like the.
Concern in
Oh yep,
Switzerland.
CERN agency. But such a cool watch.
This photograph is when they started breaking ground. for that.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
At CERN?
these two dudes are just watching as they started breaking the first land for CERN. This is the I think
Yeah, and CERN is was
so that
like
those two dudes like weeks or months later, this is what that same site looked like
that's insane.
to build the particle accelerator,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah,
believe was the it was the first one, the world's first hadron collider intersecting storage ring.
it's so cool.
And also, it's speaking of Switzerland, the World Wide Web came from Switzerland.
Did it really?
Oh yeah, yeah. What's his name? Who invented HTML? Um,
Wow. I
Tim
didn't know that.
Lee. Oh yeah, like there's so much stuff that came. LSD came from Switzerland. It's crazy. Um, and here's
What else are the
their
Swiss known for outside of watches?
all kinds of stuff.
Fondue.
Yeah, chocolate.
Fondue is awesome. That came from
Yeah,
Switzerland, I think, didn't it?
chocolate.
Chocolate, yeah.
Swiss babes.
Amen. Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I love Switzerland. I'm excited just to go to
Oh
Switzerland.
yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully next year or the year after that, I'll join you.
Oh, that'd be
Um,
so fun.
so tell our audience what they should expect and what they should tune in for as far as coverage is concerned.
So, we're going to be meeting with Rolex, and they have what is called like a touch and feel. So, the touch and feel is basically where we get hands on with the new product. And a lot of brands do this, but the technical industry term is called the touch and feel. So, we're going to be basically meeting with Rolex, and we're going to be, holding, the pieces in hand, and we're going to be providing a bunch of video content. It'll be up on like our Instagram, and then I know we're going to also be providing Rolex Magazine with photos and video of the new releases as Rolex ultimately presents it to us. So we'll be posting that on Instagram, of course, and on our social media feeds. But I think ultimately you're going to do kind of like the amazing job that you do in writing this stuff up and providing the technical details, because we're likely going to have a pretty limited amount of time with them. But I'm going to be the facilitator, and you and I are going to work to get this information out to people as quickly as we can, as well as in great detail. We're going to be doing a bunch of high res photos and video clips and all that kind of stuff.
Here's that watch you talked about with the quadrants.
Yeah. So
That's a
that's commonly
Rolex
referred to as
Zephyr,
the
isn't it?
Zephyr. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting dial too, because if you notice, it has no markers on the dial. So it has lume dots, but there isn't a fixed marker on that dial. It's a very interesting watch.
Yeah, and with the beautiful Dauphine hands, I love that design language.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so we're gonna have coverage, and I think it's very likely that hopefully we'll be breaking some amazing new Rolex news from Geneva, Switzerland, with Cam being our host.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited, and I think we can speculate, and I'm so excited. I feel like a kid sometimes when we talk about this stuff, because I feel like I'm like talking with my brother about like, what do you think you got? Like the gift is wrapped under the tree. What do you think's in there? We're like shaking the box a little bit, and we're like, oh God, like, oh, I heard this, maybe it's this, or I heard that, maybe it's this, right? I think
Hopefully, it's not a
what I'm
sweater.
yeah, no, for sure, right? I think we all have like our hopes and desires, but I'm truth is like we don't really know what Rolex is coming out with, right? And I think that that's the most exciting part about this is that I'm going to be meeting with them going into the the press room, and I almost kind of want to do like a reaction video, because like
Oh yeah.
I just don't know what is going to be coming out,
So what we're gonna do is I think Captain Danny and I are gonna do live coverage, and we're gonna start about an hour before
Yep.
to just talk a little bit and get folks up to speed. And then as the stuff is launched with
Yep.
you, we're going to try and do live coverage as much as possible. So
Yeah, basically, I think the other idea too is that I'll be, sending you the photos and the videos and that kind of stuff as I get it. So literally, I think depending on our access and our connectivity and all that kind of stuff, probably be sending this stuff to you as I see it,
Yeah.
which is amazing. And yeah, I mean, verdicts out. We don't know what they're coming out with, but the cool thing is every year Rolex comes out with something that is, a smash hit and so exciting. I think Rolex is over the past kind of leaning a bit more into their past and into their heritage. I think that the other great thing about what Rolex has done is they've done a great job of elevating the product and then in the way that they produce it, but they also are doing a great job of kind of tying in their history, which is so important. And I think they're doing that even more, more recently. Like, we just saw a Sea Dweller that was released, and that had red text on the dial, right? We saw, the cloisonne type dials, which up until this point really wasn't something that Rolex was doing. We're seeing the advancement of new materials, Yachtmaster and Sea Dweller in titanium. First time that that's ever happened with Rolex. We're seeing technical advancement, but we're also seeing it done in really the most tasteful and elegant way, that also still yields towards modern functionality. And that to me is the secret sauce, the secret recipe to why Rolex is, at the top of the key, and I think will always be at the top of the key.
Yes. And so basically this was like the pre Watches and Wonder show. We'll
Yep.
have the Watches and Wonder show, and hopefully we'll get you live from the floor of
Yeah.
Watches and Wonders. And then after we'll do maybe a week after or so,
This
or
would be
not a
fun
week,
to
but
like do this and then kind of go through our thoughts on what
exactly.
we are actually seeing.
Yes, and
So
then afterward to like a post show, maybe 3 or 4 days afterwards, or when you get back, or maybe we'll do it from maybe we could do it from Geneva. Maybe we could do a show from Geneva.
yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I mean this platform that we're using is great for us to connect, and it all I really need is a computer and a Wi-Fi connection, so we can connect basically from all over the world.
And also, Cameron is going to be joining me for a masterclass series as well, which we're going to be doing that will correlate to somewhat of an extent with my books I'm coming out with. But we're going to be doing a masterclass series on all the super iconic Rolex watches, doing super deep dives. So I think that's going to be really exciting too.
It's going to be really fun. And I think it's really the first time that this will all be in one place, because I think learning about a specific reference also means to really understand it, you have to kind of understand the history. And I think that that's really fascinating because, the history yields to the tangible so much in the case of Rolex. And to my knowledge, even for me, I'm going through countless books, going to all these different websites. To have that in one place, I think, is going to be such a valuable asset to the collector community, but also provide a place for people to really learn, and not just about that specific reference, but the history, the design language behind this stuff, all in one place. So that's really awesome and really exciting that that's in the works to exist.
Yeah, we have so much we've learned that we're going to be sharing with our viewers, historical anecdotes that nobody knows about, that have completely blown my mind.
Yeah,
And it's stuff you won't find on the internet or you won't find anywhere else. So that's really exciting to me.
yeah, me too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jake, and I'll see you in Geneva.
Perfect. Take care.